Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Asian American Speaker Series at Fresno State University. We are delighted and honored to have two esteemed guests, Dr. Shilpa Davi and Dr. Samuel Yamashita. Grace, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. So I'll go ahead and read the bio sketch for Dr. Shilpa Dave first. So Shilpa Dave is an assistant professor of media studies and American studies at the University of Virginia and an assistant dean in the College of Arts and Science, working with Bonnie Castle, Hancock, and Lyle Maupin associations. Shilpa Dave is the author of Indian Accents, Brown Voice, and Racial Performance in American Television and Film, and is the co-editor of the collection East Main Street, Asian American Popular Culture. She earned her bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and her master's and PhD from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. She came to the University of Virginia from the Department of American Studies at Brandeis University, and she has held faculty positions at Cornell University, Wesleyan University, and UW-Madison, and has been a director and assistant dean of the Multicultural Resource Center at Oberlin College. Professor Dave researches and teaches about representations of race and gender in media and popular culture, American cultural narratives of immigration and border crossings, comparative American studies, including Asian American and South Asian American studies, and film, television, and literary studies. She has published on topics ranging from teaching Asian American studies to No Life Without Wife, Masculinity and Modern Arranged Meetings for Indian Americans, to A Pooh's Brown Voice, Cultural Inflection in South Asian Accents, the comic series Spider-Man India, and on model minorities and the spelling bee.
Thank you, Grace, for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Bond, for inviting me to be a part of this lecture series and talk to your class today about Brown Voice. And so, yes, I'm coming to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, on the East Coast. I'm about 2 hours west of Washington, D.C. And I'm happy to come and see you in sunny California. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and share some slides and talk a little bit about South Asian Americans in 21st century media. And I know you're also going to be reading later a little bit of my work. So this is a little bit of a preview too, as well. So just in terms of thinking about statistically, we're seeing that in the Asian American population, there's a larger and larger group of South Asians. And so by South Asians, when you break that group down, it can include Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Burmese, Nepalese, a whole wide group of different ethnicities. Just like Asian American has multiple ethnicities, so does South Asian. And that includes different religions, different languages, and even groups that have historically been at conflict with each other too, as well. So a lot of my work is focused on looking at South Asians as a grouping created post-British Raj. And then particularly I look at Indians in the United States. That's the area that I usually talk about. But in general, I like to think about South Asians and the different kinds of variations they bring to the way in which we think about the racial politics in the US, and also the cultural and socioeconomic politics regarding Asian Americans. So in thinking about cultural studies and interdisciplinary approaches, there are different ways in Asian American studies that you can study Asian American groups. Food studies, which we're going to hear more about later, visual studies, literary studies, historical, musical studies, gender studies, disability studies, and there could be other ones too. So you can think about what other ways or what other lenses might you use to think about Asian Americans as a group and about different trends that you might see. And that's the beauty of interdisciplinary approaches, is that the lens that you're looking at, if you use Asian Americans as your subject matter, you can take any kind of lens that you want and sort of say, let me explore this particular area. For example, one of my colleagues has talked about how we think about food studies and the history of labor with regards to Asian Americans. And she's written an article called Curry as Code. And this really is thinking about South Asian Americans and Indian Americans and the tech industry, and how H-1B visas have really changed the nature of immigration, particularly for South Asians and the tech industry too, as well. From the 1990s to even as we speak today, who gets to immigrate to the United States and what kind of skills are they bringing? And thinking about how South Asians interface with technology in terms of being producers, innovators, and then what she does is she then talks about how that it crosses with food studies, and curry then becomes a descriptor that's also visual, but it's also about smell. So you can take food studies and apply it to labor and think about how South Asians fit into that in the IT industry. And so that's a way in which you can use cultural studies to do really interesting kinds of commentaries on different kinds of areas and cross over to different populations too, as well. So with Asian Americans, as many of you know, that often are seen as immigrant communities, foreigners, and also stereotypical of the model minority. And for South Asians, how do we see this in the 21st century? On television, on hit television shows, we see in The Big Bang Theory, for instance, Raj here is an immigrant. He's also, works at Caltech and is literally what we would call a rocket scientist. And, but we also had a show that premiered on NBC called Outsourced, which looked at the way in which labor was being outsourced, literally, to India and to the Philippines, where you had call centers that were starting to prop up in other countries, especially where they spoke English. And so you get this narrative of labor that is also infiltrated with this idea of the immigrant and the foreigner and the model minority. And what these shows did was they sort of reaffirmed the way in which we see South Asians as they're either in India, because the show Outsourced was set in India. In fact, it was the first show to be set outside the United States, the comedy show to be set outside the United States since MASH, which was in the 1970s, a show that was about the Korean War, and it was about a mobile hospital unit that was set in Korea. And since that time, this is another show, also a comedy that is about labor practices and call centers. So it's really interesting. It was only on for one season, but I think it was based on a film, and as another way of thinking about comedy and humor and how that's used and how we see different kinds of South Asians. This really helps us think about sort of the way in which we look at the South Asian diaspora and the way it travels from Britain to Africa to the United States to other places around the world. So one of the areas that I was interested in looking in terms of thinking about cultural studies was, how do we think about the ways in which we see representations in the media of South Asians, and particularly Asian Americans and South Asians. And oftentimes we see the version of blackface with an Asian American interface, which is yellow face and brown face, where we see white Americans or white actors putting on makeup to act like another race or ethnicity. And we can see that in the ways in which in the media we see cross casting or racialized casting or even blind casting. in all of these kinds of practices, what does it mean to be Asian on screen? And how do we really think about where we see narratives of Asian Americans versus racialized performances of what mainstream America thinks Asians should be? And if we break it down even further, you want to ask, in the kinds of visuals that you're seeing, and the kinds of series or film that you're seeing, who are the writers, who are the directors, and what kinds of stories are they telling? Are they continuing to tell the same kind of stories that cast Asian Americans and South Asians as immigrants and foreigners, or do we see more of a variety? So one of the things I would ask you to think about is, how do we see race portrayed in the media, and how do we see Asian Americans? And I was operating from the idea that oftentimes we look at visual cues to give us an understanding of what the background and what the heritage is of a particular character. But what if, instead of looking at visual cues, we focus on sonic production, and specifically vocal accents? If we start to listen and to hear how Asian Americans and South Asians are expressed from a sonic point of view, how does that modify, change, and illuminate the ways we discuss and theorize race, class, and gender? And how does this approach also influence the way we think about power, difference, or even desire? So when you think about sonic performance, and particularly about accent, I'm looking at the relationship to the English language. And oftentimes when you look at the way in which English and the way in which we think about communication and voice is evaluated, it breaks down into these categories of proficiency versus performance. So when you think about proficiency, it's usually this analytical scale, and it's related to competence. It's related to the way in which you are able to show off your knowledge of how you might speak a language. So for those of you who speak more than one language, how do you show off that you're able to speak another language? And it can be where you're fluent and you can speak without error, or it could be that you sound like you're speaking a broken form of a language, or childlike. I speak, one of the other languages I speak is French, and I always joke that I speak like a child, like a 5-year-old French person. I can speak it, but it is definitely very much in first person, and it's usually present tense. Another way you can think about proficiency is volume, the way in which someone's confident that they can speak versus if they're mumbling or it's lower. Another way that proficiency, again, is measured is by comprehension, or the way in which we understand it. So oftentimes you can take tests or diagnostics. So again, proficiency is much more related to the analytical side. And then there's performance, like how do you perform language? And sometimes that's looking at the ways in which language has changed over the years. So you can do a historical analysis. You can think about in television or film, or even on the stage, how people perform accents, whether it be a British accent or an Italian accent for a particular kind of effect. The other, and some people are known for having different, that they can really perform all over the spectrum with different kinds of accents. We also see how people imitate the way in which someone might perform. That often lends itself to, when we hear that imitation or parroting, we can think about that as also having a certain kind of tone, if it's humorous or not. We also see sound reproductions, and the fact that language performance and language mimicry, that there is an acceptability about it because it's seen as art. It's seen as that this is a way that we learn about other ways and other places too as well. So what I argue is that racial performance is actually a combination of proficiency and performance. And so when you're thinking about accent, it's situational, and it can be a racialized marker of a particular type, but it's also a performance of someone who's considered to be other. And you can use humor, but that there is a legacy, there's a long-term effect of the accent, which is the idea that you don't quite belong, that you're not, in the case of the United States, not American, that people will see you as having an accent and that you're forever foreign. And so I argue that brown voice is just as much about how we hear, it's about listening, how we hear and understand accents, as it is about the person doing the talking. How do we receive these accents? Because many of them already have a lot of baggage associated with them. And how do we then take what we're receiving and use it to modify our behavior? So as I say, the performance, I think this is really key in this, in the way in which I'm thinking about what I call brown voice. Because it's this idea of that it's a foreignness, but because English is being spoken, we can understand it. So it's an acceptable kind of foreignness, an accessible type of foreignness. And it also marks the history of people who are speaking English, particularly with South Asians, because it marks a colonial history of the British Raj. And that it's also not necessarily about not being able to speak a language, but it's also how you're speaking it, whether you're pronouncing a long A or you're not pronouncing another vowel or another kind of letter. So it's speaking differently with still a level of understanding. And so one of the key figures that you think about is where you can see this is not just in a person, but in animated figures. And I'm looking at Apu from The Simpsons, and I'm also looking at Sanjay's Super Team, where actually it's a Academy Award nominated short that that was done by Disney. And in this particular short, no one says a word, but there are all these tonal musical elements that are really interesting to look at. But the only kind of sound you hear is either the television making some noise or tonal musical sounds. The main characters don't speak, which I think is an interesting contrast to someone like Apu, who, as many of you may know, is an Indian character who is voiced by a white American male, Hank Azaria. And I think the documentary that Hari Kundabula did talks about not only what Apu does, because the show in The Simpsons has been around for over 30 years now. So it's multi-generational. And so what is the legacy of Apu, and what is the impact socially on the way in which we look at South Asians? And what I want you to think about then is, what are these new depictions and ways of storytelling that aren't necessarily stereotypical, but actually can go forth and challenge the way in which we've seen brown voice as being depicted. And those could be when we have new writers, producers, and actors that are giving us different ways of thinking about the accent and the ways in which we look at how people talk, but also, again, how we receive them too, as well. And I think, you can think about from Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay, where you're seeing Asian American alliances, and thinking about the ways in which we hear and have different people read John Cho and Kal Penn in this film, to the ways in which we see who's producing new media. And now we're seeing behind the camera, as well as in front of the camera, Asian American producers and directors, including Mindy Kaling, Raman Bahrani, and Asian American directors like Mira Nair, and all the way to M. Night Shyamalan. And finally, we're seeing new generations, particularly teen generations of South Asians. So we have Kamala Khan, who's the new Ms. Marvel, who lives in Jersey City and is a 16-year-old teenager. And we have Devi Vishnakumar, who's 16 years old, who lives in Sherman Oaks, California. And these are two different mediums. One is a comic book and one is a television series that really is looking at what South Asians are facing in terms of their everyday life, but also expanding the way in which we see South Asians, where there's not an accent. They are both second generation, and maybe some of their parents have accents, but it's also about expanding the way in which we see what South Asians are. And we see this in crossover media, particularly now with Ms. Marvel, where she's part of the MCU universe now. And we see that in television and animation and gaming, and also now as a series too. And I think the key thing here, especially if any of you have watched the new Ms. Marvel, and I highly recommend it because I think it's really a great show that has paid attention to the details of the community of Jersey City in New Jersey, but also interfamily generational issues that happen with mothers and fathers and brothers and grandparents, and also the historical narrative. I have never seen a Marvel narrative that talks about partition, and between the partition in South Asia, between India and Pakistan, and does it in a really thoughtful way that shows what our legacies are and shows the nuances of how what happened multi-generations ago impact the way in which we view ourselves and our communities. And I think that this is what we want to see when we're looking at South Asian, so that accents don't just become a way of othering, but instead a way of opening up the way in which we're seeing different kinds of groups. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to introduce you to some of these issues. And if you have any questions, we can talk about them later, or you can email me at the email below.
Wonderful. That was a great talk. Class, let's give her a hand. All right, great. All right, Grace.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dave. So we'll go ahead and move on to Dr. Samuel Yamashita. So a Confucian specialist with mastery of both classical Chinese and classical Japanese, Samuel Yamashita has written extensively about early modern and modern Japanese intellectual and cultural history, focusing most recently on Japan during World War II and Japanese infusion cuisine. In the 1990s, recognizing the dearth of primary source material pertaining to the Pacific War that he could use in his courses on modern Japan, Dr. Yamashita began to collect letters and diaries written by ordinary Japanese during the war, which he found challenged the prevailing view of a unified and patriotic Japanese citizenry and raised questions about the way the war ended with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. He has translated 65 of the 160 diaries by Japanese adults, servicemen, including kamikaze pilots, teenagers, and children that he has collected. 8 of these were published as Leaves from an Autumn of Emergencies, selections from the wartime diaries of ordinary Japanese, which is currently in its 3rd printing. Since the fall of 2005, he has given book talks all over the country and was interviewed on National Public Radio. In addition to his ongoing research in these areas, Yamashita is also writing a history of Japanese food from prehistory to the present and exploring Pacific Rim fusion cuisine as a transnational culinary phenomenon.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace. And thank you, Professor Bond, for inviting me to speak to your class. And it's amazing how much Professor Dave's comments and mine actually dovetail. I think you'll be amazed that although we're coming from very different fields and dealing with different issues, there's amazing overlap. Can you hear me okay? Everything okay? Yes?
Yes, perfectly, perfectly.
Okay, great. I'd like to talk today about how I ended up writing this book, Hawaii Regional Cuisine, the Food Movement that Changed the Way Hawaii Eats. And I'd like to talk first about what led me to write this book. Students will be interested in what drives us to write books. Second, I'll talk about what I discovered as I did research for this book. And finally, why what I discovered is important and something that all of us should know. And it's really the third point that will resonate with Professor Dave's comments. So this is what led me to write my book. It's a pair of cruets that I found on a table at a fancy restaurant at a resort on the Big Island in Hawaii. On the left is a cruet holding soy sauce, and on the right is a cruet holding what we call in Hawaii chili pepper water. And I was surprised to see these on the table at a fancy restaurant because they're usually found in the homes of local people in the islands, people who grew up in the islands, people who were mostly not Anglo, not white. And soy sauce and chili pepper water were never found at fancy restaurants. And so when the waitress came over, I asked her, I said, why do you have bottles of soy sauce and chili pepper water on the table? What's going on? And she said, well, we have a new chef. His name is Alan Wong, and it's his idea. And that conversation took place in August 1992. And I never forgot that conversation. And finally, in 2009, I set out to answer the question, what's going on? And it took me 10 years to answer the question. So students, this is what happens when you decide to write a book. It takes a while. And in the course of my research, I discovered that the short 3-word answer to my question was Hawaii Regional Cuisine. And what happened was that in August 1991, a group of chefs cooking in Hawaii got together to talk about what else? Food, and especially about how to get better ingredients, especially fresh vegetables and fresh fish, to use in their cooking, because frozen fish was still used in restaurants in Hawaii through the 1970s. And what the group ended up doing was first grandly announcing that they were going to cook something that they called Hawaii Regional Cuisine. And second, they decided that they would establish personal relationships with the people who supplied them, with farmers, with fishermen and women, with ranchers, coffee growers, cheese makers, and so forth. And the result was that these chefs, the HRC chefs, got better and fresher vegetables, fish, pork, lamb, cheese, and coffee. Now, there's something else that you need to know about Hawaii Regional Cuisine. It was one of several regional cuisine movements that appeared in the US beginning in the 1970s. There was first California cuisine in California, represented by Alice Waters and Chez Panisse and other restaurants. There was also the New American Cuisine in the 1980s in New York City and Chicago. There was also Southwestern Cuisine, which appeared around the same time that Hawaii Regional Cuisine did in the 1980s in the Southwest. But something else happened in the wake of that August 1981 meeting. HRC chefs also discovered local food, the food that local people of color mostly, ate every day in the islands, things like chow mein, saimin, lumpia, sushi, and kalua pig, which is pork cooked Hawaiian style in an underground oven. And what they discovered were all the things served in the form of plate lunches at places like this, Rainbow Drive-In, a veritable temple of local food in Honolulu. I feel sure that some of you have had plate lunches, and if you haven't, go out and get some quick. Local food was never served at fancy restaurants until the HRC chefs came along. And you might ask, well, why was local food never served at fancy restaurants? Well, first, because the chefs at those places looked down on local food, but more fundamentally, local food wasn't French. And this view of local food was a product of two larger developments, which intersect with those that Professor Dave mentioned. First, it was the result of the impact that Euro-American colonialism had on the islands. Hawaii was a US colony from 1898 to 1959. And of course, the Philippines was another US colony from 1898 to 1945. But the second reason for the invisibility of local food was the dominance of French cuisine in the restaurant world in the US and Europe. That is, the top restaurants in the US and Europe until the 1980s served French or Italian cuisine. And so after that August 1981 meeting, the HRC chefs began to buy directly from producers, from the farmers who grew the herbs and vegetables they needed, from the fishermen and women who caught the fish they served, the ranchers who raised the cattle, pigs, and lambs they served, as well as from a host of other producers. But the HRC chefs also began to add local dishes to their menus. And so one began to have things like egg rolls, tempura, even sashimi. And in the process of doing this, the HRC chefs began to use non-French cooking techniques, that is to say, local cooking techniques. And the best example of this is what HRC chefs did with a very local dish called the locomoco. And I hope some of you have had the locomoco, yes? And the locomoco was invented in 1949 in Hilo by a local restaurant to feed some teenage boys who were about to play in a football game and who needed protein and carbohydrates to sustain them. And the locomoco consisted of cooked short grain rice, on which was placed sauteed hamburger patty, which was then slathered with brown gravy and then topped with a fried egg. And this is a photograph of the locomoco served at a place called the Cafe 100 in Hilo, Hawaii. Well, the HRC chefs, almost all of them, came up with their own versions of the locomoco. And my favorite was Alan Wong's version of the locomoco. This is a close-up. It's a kind of food pornography, I mean, to look at a locomoco this closely. And Alan Wong's locomoco consisted of a patty of deep fried mochi rice, on which was placed a fried patty made with Wagyu beef and unagi, Japanese eel. And that was then slathered with kabayaki sauce, a sauce that's used with eel dishes in Japan, and then topped with a fried quail egg. In the end, Hawaii regional cuisine also created spaces for chefs to add other local dishes. So Bev Gannon, who was from Texas, added tacos made with local ingredients to her menu. Peter Merriman, who was from Pennsylvania, added his version of upside down cake to his menu. But all things considered, the impact that Hawaii regional cuisine had was to dethrone French cuisine from its elevated position and to make it one of many cuisines represented at restaurants in Hawaii. So one had dishes made with ingredients and cooking techniques from many different cuisines, and this allowed for real borrowing from other cuisines. The same trend was occurring on the US mainland in the 1990s. Asian cuisine was fused with French and Italian cuisine, producing a new Franco-Japanese, Franco-Asian cuisine at restaurants like Roy's in Honolulu, or Chinois en Main in Los Angeles, or the Quilted Giraffe in New York City. The same trend produced a new Italo-Japanese cuisine in Hawaii, California, and New York City. It's represented well by Joseph Centeno's restaurant, Orsa and Winston. So why does all of this matter? Well, these developments that started with Hawaii regional cuisine had a liberating effect for Asian and Asian American chefs. It gave them a new freedom. And so it allowed them to cook dishes inspired by their family's native cuisine. And so Filipino chef Sheldon Simeon made his pork adobo when he appeared on Top Chef. And both the judges and viewers all over the world went wild. Some of you may have seen Sheldon Simeon on Top Chef. Second, this new freedom allowed Asian and Asian American chefs to honor their ancestors by cooking their dishes. And so Andrew La of Piggy Smalls in Honolulu makes his own version of pho, which his parents approve of. They were very skeptical at first, but after he made his pho, they said it's terrific. Third, it also allowed Asian and Asian American chefs to make the dishes that their second or third generation mothers and fathers made. And Wade Ueoka of MW in Honolulu serves a version of a dish that his mother made every New Year's with leftover rice cakes. And it's called mochi crusted onaga. I was at the restaurant in August and he still offers it. And fourth, this freedom allowed Asian and Asian American chefs to make the dishes that they dreamed about. And I feel sure that Alan Wong conceived this dish in a dream. It consists of Chinese-style steamed fish, Cantonese pork hash, and a French truffle butter sauce. And he called the dish opakapaka with shrimp pork hash in a truffle nage. And it's a tremendous dish that unfortunately is no longer made because Alan Wong's no longer exists. But all of these developments sparked by Hawaii regional cuisine have had an interesting impact in California in the last decade. And I would date it from 2010. In California, we now have a new generation of Asian American chefs who are unabashedly making their own food in their own way. In San Francisco, there's Brandon Ju, who makes Chinese American food at his restaurant, Mr. Ju's. And Brandon Ju is very explicit about what he's making. He says, it's not Chinese food for mainland Chinese. It's Chinese food for San Francisco. And Brandon Ju's description of himself is also revealing. He said, when I lived in China, no one thought I was Chinese. And it started to make me realize I'm not really Chinese, I'm Chinese American. And this past spring, Brandon Ju was named Best Chef in California by the James Beard Foundation, which is like winning an Oscar in the restaurant world. In Los Angeles, John Yao makes Taiwanese American food at his new restaurant, Kato. He makes food that was inspired by his mother's Taiwanese dishes. And he says his food has to be different because, as he puts it, every time a cuisine comes to America, it's a different set of local produce and local taste. And his restaurant was recently named just 2 weeks ago one of the top 50 restaurants in the US by the New York Times. Also in Los Angeles, Nikki Nakayama is making her Los Angeles and Southern California version of the refined Japanese kaiseki cuisine. She follows the 13 or 14 course kaiseki format, but she makes it with Southern California ingredients, some of which she grows in her own garden, some of which is seafood from the California coast. And after she was on Chef's Table, her dinners have become so popular that it's very hard to get a reservation. I think they scalp reservations to her restaurant. And in San Francisco, Corey Lee's restaurant, Bennu, is offering his version of Korean dishes, his amazing versions of Korean dishes. Lee worked at Thomas Keller's restaurants for over a decade, the French Laundry in Napa, Per Se in New York City, before he turned to Korean cuisine, and Bennu recently made the world's top 50 restaurant list. So what to say in conclusion? Let me kind of wrap up my points. What I've argued today is that Hawaii regional cuisine was important, and it made a number of other developments possible. In the first place, it created greater equity among cuisines. It diminished hegemonic French cuisine. It cut down to size, bullying male French chefs, and elevated other non-French cuisines. And when I interviewed Asian chefs who had cooked at French restaurants, they always talked about the bullying, some of which was physical, but most of which was psychological. Second, HRC created a space for chefs of color. HRC produced Roy Yamaguchi and Alan Wong, both James Beard winners. It paved the way for Nikki Nakayama, and it anticipated Brandon Ju and Jonathan Yao. Third, HRC liberated Asian and Asian American chefs. It allowed them to cook their ancestors' and families' food, as Yao does at Cato in Los Angeles. It also let them dream and dream up new dishes like Alan Wong's opakapaka with shrimp pork hash in a truffle nage, or as in the case of what Corey Lee does at Bennu, a whole new Korean cuisine. And last but not least, HRC made it possible for chefs to be themselves, for Asian and Asian American chefs to be themselves, who they really are, not who they were supposed to be. It allowed Brandon Ju to be a Chinese American chef, and it allowed Sheldon Simeon to be a Pinoy. So these are the things that my work on HRC helped me to see that I had not noticed before, and I hope you see the parallels with what Professor Dave talked about in her remarks. So thank you for your attention. And I will stop the share.
All right, everyone, let's give a hand. That was excellent. Great 2 talks. All righty. What a great treat for Fresno State, this high level of, of scholarship. So I'm going to open up to questions. Does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself or you can put yourself in the chat. I guess I'll start you guys up while you're thinking about questions. For Sam and for Shilpa, I'm kind of always interested in the personal story, right? I love, Sam, how you talked about how you got in the research. And so Shilpa and Sam, can you explore like the personal reason why you kind of go into this research?
Shilpa, go ahead.
Sure. I think that one of the ideas behind going on this is that I noticed when South Asians and Indians were on TV as I was growing up in the United States, and I noticed when they weren't on TV too. And so I think when you have representations and you don't see yourself in the media, you're looking for ways in which you see something unusual. And when you keep on seeing the same things over and over again, you're like, is there a pattern, or why is this a particular way? Why do they always have someone with an accent? And why do people laugh at it? Why is it always seen as humorous when it might be humorous to others, but not necessarily to me? And I think that's when I started to look at okay, let's look and look at the representation. And then when you peel back the sort of the area around or the research behind it, then you're like, oh, Apu's voiced by a white man. That's a problem. Why is that? And why is that different? And how is that similar to somebody putting on black makeup or yellow face, or taping their eyelids and pretending to be another race? when you're using vocal intonations. And that to me was new. And so it's those ha moments, I think. And that's what I love about is that it makes you curious. And I love, Sam, that you went to a restaurant and you're like, wow, why is that?
Mhm.
And I have those moments too, as well. When I started working on Ms. Marvel, I was like, wow, this is really great to have these comic book characters who are actually sort of new characters who are showing life as it is now and are not just reboots
Mhm.
of the 1940s or the 1920s or the 1960s, but showing your histories in different ways. So that's how I got in, is because I love television and I love comics and I love popular culture. So I think that's sort of the kinds of things that I was noticing. But now I'm also hungry too.
Well, that's a great lead-in. I like Dr. Dave, I also like food. And I wasn't planning to work on food until I had lunch with my editor from the University of Hawaii Press in 2009. And at the end of the lunch, she said, just out of the blue, how'd you like to write a history of Japanese food? And I was already in my early 60s and I knew enough not to answer right away. I said, well, let me think about this. And so I took the idea home and I thought about it for half a year. You know, what kinds of sources would I use and how would I organize it? What kinds of narratives would I write? And I emailed her back and I said, sure, yeah, I think I can do this. But I said, you and I know that you'll be long retired before I finish. And she retired, I think, around 5 years ago. And I won't finish my history of Japanese food until probably the late 2020s. You know, I'm not rushing. But I started to write the HRC book partly because I was having to visit my widowed father in Hawaii 4 or 5 times a year. I'm the oldest son, and I had to go home and look in on him. And I thought I need to write off these trips. And so there was that dimension as well, together with seeing the two cruets on that table at the resort on the Big Island. But so those are the personal. Of course, I grew up in Hawaii, and I grew up eating local food, and was shocked and surprised and overjoyed when I saw that local food was reappearing now in new forms and had acquired a different status, that it wasn't something to be rejected or overlooked, but something to be put forward, championed, and developed in new ways.
Great. Thank you for your personal stories. Class, do you guys have any questions for our speakers?
I actually have two questions. I have one for each. So I guess I could start with Dr. Dave. So one thing that you talked about kind of towards the end of your presentation was seeing kind of like representation in like younger characters, like newer generation, like second generation type characters. And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk more about like the impact of having that representation in those younger characters. And like, because I'm taking Dr. Bond's cultural studies class, and one thing we talk about is like those pop culture and like media, and how impactful those types of representation can be. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. I think that it's really interesting to look at these generational stories, and we've always seen them in terms of narratives, where it's the immigrant generation, you know, versus the American-born generation, and we see that trope over and over again. But I think there's a long enough history of Asians in the United States that we know that it's not just first and second generations anymore. There's third, fourth, and as you know, fifth, sixth generations. So what I thought was so brilliant about Sam's talk was the idea of how we're seeing the regional cuisines where people are expressing themselves through food, and they're expressing the different generational ways of looking at and experiencing food. And I think that's what I see in media studies now, and representations, where we're not just getting first and second generation, but we're starting to see across the board. And I've noticed this in the last, I would say, 7 years or so, triple generations now. And we're seeing this particularly in sitcoms, where you have the grandparents, the immigrant generations, and the American born. Or you are also getting this idea of older American born and the third generations, which are oftentimes mixed race too, which I think is interesting. So I think we're starting to see an expansion of different kinds of representations. And so I'm really happy to see that. And that's what I've been following, especially in relationship to accent and the way in which language is looked at, because now you're also seeing with 3 generations, this idea of an original language, or a heritage language, and people saying, oh, you don't just have to know English, you don't just have to learn English and forget where you came from, that you can speak multiple different languages too. And there's a appreciation of that, which we didn't used to see before.
Thank you. And then I also had a question for Dr. Yamashita. So one thing that you talked about in your presentation, I think it was specifically about Brandon Jew. And there was like a point about that really resonated with me. And it was when you said he was able to differentiate that he was Chinese American and not just Chinese. And I was wondering if you could talk more about like the connection between cuisine and like that sort of identity. Because again, I also took like a foodways course that we have here where you talk about like Asian American food and how that can tie into like community and identity. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about that too.
Thank you. That's a great question. I watched an episode of a program called Migrant's Kitchen, which I highly recommend. And there was a segment on Brandon Jew. There was also a segment on John Yao. And I think what impressed me, and I need to tell you that I'm a 3rd generation Japanese American, so I was born in 1946. And I was amazed that Brandon Jew could articulate so explicitly the distinction between being Chinese and being Chinese American. And frankly, I found his statement psychologically liberating, that what it meant was that any person of Asian descent raised in the US, even born elsewhere, but raised in the US, could now define him or herself as a, quote, Chinese American or an Indian American or a Japanese American. And that freedom and psychological freedom didn't exist when I was young in the 1950s and 1960s, where we struggled to become, Japanese, or struggled to become Chinese. And so I went back to Japan as a junior, not speaking any Japanese and learning Japanese. And of course, when I was there, I spoke like a 4 or 5-year-old, and people would laugh when I spoke in Japanese early on. And I realized later that they thought I was retarded. And so I would laugh with them, and not knowing what they were saying. And I just find the freedom that Brandon Jew is talking about really important for, people who come of age in the US, no matter what their ethnicity. I just think, it took courage for him to say that on the air. And you'll have to look at the episode of Migrant's Kitchen on Brandon Jew. And you also sense that, it was not easy for him, that he struggled. And obviously it took some abuse when he was in China, when I'm sure chefs said to him, "What are you cooking? Is that Chinese food?" So yeah, I think it's an important moment in the history and study of Asian Americans.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a question as well. So I first off want to say thank y'all for being here today. I really loved how your presentations and discussions greatly overlapped. I remember seeing the flyer, like how are these going to play hand in hand? But I feel like it was such a meaningful conversation that I really enjoyed. So I'm a first generation Hmong American, and I really love that y'all share your stories and how even though I don't identify in the same group of Asians, like I'm Southeast Asian compared to like East Asian or South Asian, that I could definitely identify with a lot of the experiences y'all shared. I wanted to know if you could share with us for both Dr. Dave and Dr. Yamashita, if you can share what are practices you'd suggest to resist the idea of being perpetual foreigners?
Good question. Dr. Dave, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question, Belle. I think, one, you have to figure out there's no one answer to that. And so how do you figure out sort of your path? I think if you can find community, and I know that's like a very broad-minded, broad way of answering that, but if you're able to find people who you have affinity with, who you can say that this is a method that I do, and it could be through creativity and creative enterprises and things that you do. It could be through the work you do. It could be through advocacy. But one of the things that you want to think about is where you personally stand too, knowing that there's no right way to do this. Just to, I think if you're not seeing something, or if you are seeing something that is not working for you, then you want to be able to talk about it. And how do you learn to express yourself? And taking this class is great because you're looking at how different Asian Americans have sort of thought about their identity across history and across generations. And then what do you want to do to talk about that? And my big advice is I always say that we need to get more of our stories outside. And so I always liked to have my students do oral histories of people that they knew or of their families, where you're talking to your parents or your aunts or your uncles or friends, and you're recording their stories and taking their stories down, because that's the way that you sort of expand the notion of these stereotypes that we see. So that's sort of the practical advice. I love, and then you have a different kind of relationship than with your parents or with your family when you start to ask them, what were their dreams? What were their aspirations? And what are their hopes? And it helps you figure out who you are too, as well. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I wish somebody had given me that advice when I was young. That's wonderful advice. One of the things that many immigrants and people of color in the US have had to deal with is violence. And sometimes, it takes real courage to stand up to violence. And so when I was first teaching in upstate New York, in a small town called Geneva, New York, I was on my way to my office on a Sunday afternoon to work on the lectures for the next day or the next week. And I discovered the hood of our Volkswagen up, and somebody had ripped out the wires. And I thought, oh, kids playing pranks. And so we called our Volkswagen mechanic, and he came over and fixed it. Well, the following year, the same thing happened, but the Volkswagen was parked in the history parking lot on campus. And this time, the damage that was done was much more extensive. People got on the roof of the Volkswagen, jumped and smashed the roof down. They tore off the side mirrors, and they took a baseball bat to the engine and smashed the engine as much as they could. But this time, they were caught. And it was two frat boys who were from Hartford, as I recall. And I was in my second year of teaching. I was an instructor. I hadn't even finished my PhD. So I was very nervous about how this was going to be dealt with. So I I decided, and I didn't even talk to my colleagues, I decided that I would just have the police deal with this. And so the police came and they investigated, and the two boys were, asked to appear in court. And the RA, the resident advisor for one of the boys, came to see me. And he said, he'd like you to drop the charges. And I said, well, there are a couple of problems. The first problem is, why didn't he come himself? Second problem is, it's not my car, it's my wife's car. And she's eager to have charges pressed. And so anyway, the boys were put on probation, and I think they graduated eventually. But every December 7th after that, we hid our car in the backyard of a Jewish colleague. And just to avoid the nuisance of not having a car for a week when it was being fixed. And I had another friend who was also untenured, handsome, young, gay, white guy, whose father was a college president. And he said to me, I have an idea. I said, what's that? He said, I have guns. Let's park the car on Main Street and hide in the bushes. And I said, Eric, we can't do that. We don't have tenure yet. And so I tell this story often, wherever I've been teaching, as a story that reveals something quite horrible. I was only one of 3 people of Japanese descent in this small town, and I was the one closest to the college. But it's also a way of sort of dealing with something quite serious and upsetting in a kind of light way. And I discovered not long ago that my grandfather, who owned a store in a plantation town on the Big Island, he had inherited the store because the previous owner, also Japanese, in fact, the founder of the first Japanese-owned store in Hawaii, had been lynched. And he was lynched by 4 white workers from the plantation who were sent to take care of him. And it happened in 1889 in the plantation town of Honokaa. And if you do research on violence against Asians in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it follows very closely the pattern that one sees in the South, for example. There were tremendous numbers of lynchings in California. And they were generally lynchings of people of color. Lots of Chinese were lynched or burned out. And so, as we deal with these issues, we also have to have full knowledge of what has gone before. And I don't think lynchings occur very often now, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen. So I think I'm a historian, and so I'm inclined to look at the past, carefully, and to report what I find truthfully. And I think it's important that we tell the truth about what has happened, not only to our group, but to people of color, people who are different in the United States. So that's a slightly darker response to that good question.
I just want to follow up with that. I went on, as many of you know, Charlottesville was the site 5 years ago of extreme violence, and with the Unite the Right rally, and the killing of Heather Hare. And I went with a group of folks from Charlottesville to go south on a civil rights tour. And one of the places we went was a new museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, I'd never been to Alabama before. And so this was, I wanted to go to these places that I had heard about.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the areas that we were going to was the Legacy Museum, and then the Lynching Memorial. And it was very, very powerful. And we also were going to, the Equal Justice Center too, as well, in Montgomery, Alabama. And so when I was going on this tour, I was learning and familiarizing myself with the geography. But what I also saw was that in front of the Equal Justice Center was Maya Lin's Civil Rights Memorial. And so what I kept on looking for during this whole trip was, where are Asian Americans in this narrative of the South? And there are lots of Asian Americans that are in the South and that are interrupting the different kinds of narratives, including, Maya Lin's sculpture, who I think is the, most amazing architect of the 20th century, and doing a civil rights memorial. Then I was so thrilled to see that, because I had seen it on film, but was able to really experience it. And I was so excited, but a lot of the other people didn't know about who Maya Lin was or what her history was. And so that was where we were able to share, like, these are the kinds of things that can bring us together. And in the Legacy Museum, there's a lot of darkness, but at the end of the museum, there's also artwork and music and joy too. So when you're looking at a lot of the different kinds of histories that we are experiencing and different kinds of things that we're going through, I want to say that there's the, the darkness and the trauma, but there's also a way in which people become creative out of that too. And there can be happiness and joy. It's not all just one note.
Thank you. That's a great point, Dr. Davi, because I always hesitate to emphasize, obviously, we've had 10,800 anti-Asian sentiments, including murder. So, but I don't want students to, I want them to be knowledgeable, but I do want them to understand Asian joy, Asian happiness, and, Asian food as a kind of a sort of like a, your two wonderful talks as something to think about as well. All right, wonderful. Now, class, do we have any more? I think you unmute yourself. Do we have any more questions?
I had one question, Professor Yamashita. What's South Asian cuisine like on Hawaii?
Good question.
Great question. South Asian cuisine has a presence in the islands, but it's still getting established. And I think you probably know Krishnendu Ray at NYU, and I've always sensed that I think it was his hope. Well, I shouldn't speak for him. That I think there was the hope that Floyd Cardos, who had a wonderful Indian restaurant
Yes.
on Avenue, that he would help to establish South Asian cuisine as a, quote, foreign cuisine, because Krishnendu Ray argues that what happens in the course of the 90s and early 2000s is that Japanese cuisine moves from being an ethnic cuisine to a foreign cuisine. And I think it was his hope, and the hope of many others, that Floyd Cardos would help to establish South Asian cuisine as a foreign cuisine, that would elevate and carry all other South Asian restaurants. And I'm not sure that's happened in the US. It certainly happened overseas. In London, there are fabulous South Asian restaurants that have Michelin stars, Benares and places like that. But in the US and in Hawaii, maybe it hasn't happened exactly yet. Can you think of any South Asian restaurants that?
Yeah, in DC, there are a couple of restaurants that are starting to do more fusion and elevating and bringing different, but it's still, I think, still even, I would like to see more like food trucks too, as well, because I think that's where a lot of creativity can happen. And we're seeing it with other cuisines. So I'd like to see more too. And I just want to say that I'm so glad, Top Chef and the Food Network and all these food shows actually are really a great way in thinking about how media platforms bring food and stories of food to to a wider audience, and I think allow for these stories and these narratives to happen. And so, the fact that Padma Lakshmi is, this after the second year was the host of Top Chef is also, to me is also a way of thinking about, a person of color who is not just a host, but she's become a connoisseur in her own right.
Can I share a South Asian food story that I forgot to mention? There's a new restaurant in Los Angeles called Camphor, and it's a French restaurant, and its two owners are one, a Thai American from Diamond Bar, Professor Bond's hometown, and the other owner is a South Asian chef from somewhere in South Asia, and the two of them met at the Alain Ducasse restaurant in Bangkok and decided to move to LA to open a new restaurant. And the Thai American chef had a good sense of haute cuisine in LA. And he was very eager that his partner not sample the local cuisine and be influenced by what was being done at fine dining establishments in LA. So he shielded him from these other restaurants in LA, and they opened about 3 or 4 months ago. And the result is that their cuisine, their food is distinctive, and it's unlike anything else being cooked in LA. And it represents, the direct transmission from South Asia through Bangkok to LA. So that's another, I think, great story. We'll have to see how things turn out at some point. But yeah, food is a great medium and a great source for cultural studies. Even though I'm not really a cultural studies person, I'd like to recognize that.
It is, and I think it fosters community too, as well, if you try somebody else's food. And because does Fresno have different Indian restaurants? Because there's been a long history of South Asians in the area.
So, Dr. Devi, we have curry pizza. Have you ever had that before?
No, you just sent me the link. That looks terrific.
It is the most delicious thing in the entire world. You can get butter chicken on a pizza or tikka masala or paneer on a pizza. It is literally heaven. I almost get it almost every week, but at least every 2 weeks we'll get it. It is a little pricey, but you're getting a whole butter chicken on top of pizza. It's phenomenal. And I always have my students do a extra credit to try it, and they come back and saying it is phenomenal. It's one of the most delicious. I don't know how it came about. I'm guessing from the Punjabi, the Mexican, maybe the other. I don't know what. It's the most. Yes, if you ever drive through Fresno, that's a must-have. I think we're one of the only cities, I think, because of our combination of cultures, but it's unbelievably great. Grace, have you had it?
Did Mr. Ahmed have a question? I thought he had unmuted himself.
I did. I was only going to ask a question for you, Yamashita, as if implemented any of your own style onto any of the dishes you ever tried before, and did you find it interesting, or do you find it's well-being, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I have to say that my wife is such a good cook that I don't cook much, except maybe when she's away or when she doesn't want to cook. Yeah, I think all of us in our own ways create. And whenever we make something, we can't help but inflect what we make in ways that reflect our biographies and where we're from and where we've been. But I can't think of any particular dish that I would want to describe in public. But I've had my creative moments. But thank you for that good question.
Of course. And I was going to also ask, have you also, aside from that of what social media or media, TV shows, and so on that portrayed any like sort of like stereotypical or let's say like indifference or prejudice against like these groups of people? Like, have you seen any other methods that was probably like used as well?
To sort of challenge stereotypes? Yes. Oh, besides television and film. And I think the one area that I would like people to explore, because it's not my forte, is music. I think music is really a way in which you can, it's another sort of cultural form like food, that people feel like they can be a part of. And so that's an area that I'd say is really worth exploration, and thinking about how music travels, the ways in which we hear soundtracks. So this is another version of social media, but thinking about musical soundtracks, or even sound effects too, as well. And then the other area that I think is, it's not so much social media. There's ways in which obviously YouTube and TikTok have had people putting on their own stories too, as well. So I think that that's a really, really important way to have people share their stories. The only thing I worry about though is that sometimes you get into a, tunnel vision, and you're not able to see how those stories connect to a larger history. And that's why I think it's important to look at, historically what the trajectory has been, so that you're not repeating a lot of things that are happening right now. Like there's this whole, 80s revival or 90s revival where people are remaking shows, and they're recasting or changing them. I was just thinking of Quantum Leap, which I grew up watching in the 80s, and the main character is Asian American man now. I think that it's great to see people like redoing things, but I really do believe that context is really important too, as well. And so that's what I encourage people, is to learn more about the histories too, as they get into the creative process. You don't want to let that inhibit you, but it's important to always to see what your work is producing, where it is in relationship to other kinds of things too.
I think one of the things that all of you should notice, and Professor Bond should talk about, is I think my response is very gendered. And I think if you were to compare our responses, there's a significant gender difference, but there's also a generational difference. And, I think when I started out in the academic world, I was always often the first person of color in a department. And I would hope, Dr. Dave, that by the time you were on the job market, that had changed. But I don't know, I think it's important to keep in mind both generational and gender differences. I think my focusing on violence may also have a gender dimension. So I apologize for that, but it's the way I've looked at myself and my past and my family's past in Asia. And of course, I worked on World War II, and so how could I not recognize the place of violence? But I think there's those significant dimensions as well. We've silenced your students.
Oh no, I'm still here. I'm still here.
I think that's why, generationally, I'm thinking more, of creativity and generative kinds of ways of responding to these too, as well. But even I'm generationally, I'm also older now too. And so as your generation is, where you are much more focused on, you have the world in your pocket, literally, if you have a phone, right? And so how do you, gather your news? Where do you do your research? how do you hear about things is very different than the way I do too. And so if something goes viral, or even when we're talking about, television shows, like how do you guys even interface with television? It could be different from what the way in which I do. If you're watching on your screen as opposed to watching on a large scale movie screen, that makes a difference too, as well. So I think to keep in mind how what our perspective is as we approach these issues, that's also important too, as well.
Thank you for your insight on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. For bringing, I never thought of generational or gender. So that was a really good, really opened up my eyes, because I think the students are Generation Z. So they have their own, I'm sure they're probably viewing you differently than what I would have viewed you from, being my millennial type of background. So interesting.
Are you are you guys Gen Z or are you Alpha? Are you Alpha generation now, Gen A?
I think we're majority just Gen Z.
Most, okay, because the next one is A now. It's Alpha.
Really?
Yeah,
Never saw that coming.
I know.
And then a lot of the students are going to watch this later on YouTube. So those are,
That's right.
I don't know how I would prefer just watching it you live, but some people prefer, I guess, the YouTube version, which is I find shocking, but okay. All
It's
right.
really for those who procrastinate. It's a joke.
Any other questions from anyone in the audience? Or our two esteemed guests, if any questions to each other?
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.
And thank you for bringing us together. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, I think that's, I'm going to close it out. Class, let's give them a hand. All righty. Thank you. This was a pleasure and an honor to have two such esteemed academics come to our Fresno State. We look forward very much to reading your books and also your articles. They're also in my class. So thank you so much. And this will be on YouTube after I upload it tonight. I'll send you the link and also the copy. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.